We're in Haftarah Beshalach, and this comes from Judges chapter 4, starting with verse 4, all the way to the end, chapter 5, verse 31. So if you have not already read these chapters, go ahead and do so, and then join back up. I like how this Haftarah focuses on the initiative of women in God's grand story of redemption and rescue. Because this is the Haftarah where we have the story of Deborah, that's her Hebrew name, and Yael. Now, the setting for the stories in this Haftarah, this is about 200 years after the conquest of the land of Israel by the 12 tribes. Now, remember, Moses passed the mantle of leadership on to Joshua, and then Joshua led the Israelites from the wilderness to the land of Israel, and then he led them in conquering the land from the Canaanites. And then the mantle was passed from Joshua to a series of judges. Now, Deborah was the fourth of the judges, and she was also a prophetess, which I think is kind of cool. So the 12 tribes didn't have a central government, and so they looked to the judges for leadership. Judges like Deborah would have functioned kind of like a high court, so they would settle cases that like the lower court judges couldn't resolve. The other thing I think would be good to point out as far as background is that the conquest of the land was incomplete, and it left pockets of Canaanites throughout the land. So, as I said before, Israel didn't have a central government, so they were basically a loosely structured confederation of tribes that were led by these series of judges. And they also didn't have a standing army. Now, that's significant for me to bring that up, because the Canaanites had quite the army. And the leader of, or the commander, like the commander of the Canaanite army, his name was Sisera, and he was in charge of like this really strong division of iron chariots. So when you think of iron chariots in the ancient Near East, think of like, they're kind of like the equivalent of our modern tanks, okay? Now, Sisera had been raiding kind of up in the north of Israel, and in doing that, he cut off several of the tribes whose allocation was in the north, kind of cut them off from the rest of the country of Israel. And for further background, in Judges chapter 4 and 5, we know that Sisera oppressed the tribes. He extorted them to pay tribute, very unreasonable tribute to him. And at this time, there wasn't really anyone among the 12 tribes who sort of would rise up and rally against these evil forces. And we also learn from this Haftarah that Deborah realizes that what's going on, what's happening to the tribes by way of the oppression of the Canaanites, is because Israel has pretty much chosen new gods to serve. Now, during the time, the long span time of the judges, the children of Israel would often lapse into idol worship, and they had to be brought back to truth again. Now, lest any of us think that we would have done better at staying loyal to God back then, remember that Israel was a pocket of people that were serving one God, but they were doing so amongst others all around them who were worshiping several gods at once. So they had that to contend with. And old habits die hard, and there's peer pressure that abounds. So what the Holy One would do is he would send an enemy to wake up his people again, to help them to remember him. And if you notice, there's a pattern that goes on with this over and over and over again. The people would forget God. He would send an enemy that would oppress them. In that oppression, the people would remember him, and they would cry out to be saved by him, not those false gods that they'd been kind of entangled with, because they would realize that those false gods actually have no power to save them, and then they would turn back to God, and then God would save them. I wonder, do you ever notice this pattern in your own life? Because I do, in mine. Now, maybe it's not idolatry that I fall into, but clearly there are times where I forget God. And it's usually when I'm trying to solve my own problems, and I don't look to a foreign God, but I do look to something else besides God to help. I mean, like, I literally forget that he's in my life. And then he'll put on the pressure, and that usually jolts me to remember that actually he is the only one that can help me in this particular situation. And it's in that sort of jolting that I remember, oh, I need to look to God, whether it's for wisdom, whether it's for comfort, whether it's for strength. And I know you know this in your own experience, he always helps us. So back to Sisera. Sisera attacks the tribes in the north. And the other thing that we learn in this Haftarah is that each of the tribes kind of put their own interests first. And so they don't combine together, all 12 of them, to offer aid to the ones that are kind of being attacked by Sisera. And I'm wondering, if they'd only come together as one, they probably would have been able to defeat Sisera's army. But it's because they were isolated and scattered. So I think this is more evidence to show that when we forsake God, which they were doing, we also forsake brothers and sisters. Now, this can preach, right? Are we, as the body of Messiah, are we too busy with our own interests that we don't ally together with one another in the body and help support the parts of the body that are being attacked by outside forces? Do we even know what the other parts of the body are? Or can we not even identify our own tribesmen anymore to help them when they are being attacked? Do we even know what it means to be attacked? Do we think this group over here is an outsider when in reality, according to God, we're in the same family? So these are some things that kind of brought to my attention in this particular Haftarah. So next, let's take a look at the Haftarah tie-in. So we have songs tying in the Torah portion to the Haftarah. In the Torah, we've got the songs at the sea, when the Israelites safely crossed the sea. We've got Moses and Miriam singing those victory songs. And in the Haftarah, we have Deborah singing a victory song. There's a key phrase that repeats in both the portion and the Haftarah. In the portion, it says God confounded the camp of Egypt. And in the Haftarah, it says that God confounded Sisera. So we have that repeating word. And then, Pharaoh had chariots. Sisera had chariots. Egypt says, let's run away from Israel because God is on their side. And then we have Sisera getting down from his chariot and running away on foot. We have the Egyptian threat drowned in the sea, and it says, not a one was left. And we have that same phrasing with the Canaanites at the Kishon Brook, and it says, not one was left. Now, whenever we encounter repeated phrases or repeated events, we can know that it is intentional. When the texts are parallel, then we can know that the events that they describe are also parallel. That makes sense. So we can ask questions of each of these events from the portion and the Haftarah. And something that stands out in both of these events is the use of this horse-drawn chariot, right? For both Egypt's army and Sisera's army, they had this huge military advantage. And these chariots would have been unbeatable in battle under normal circumstances. But when we're dealing with God's rescue plan that's initiated because his children cry out to him to save them, what we get is anything but normal circumstances. Now, I love what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory, what he says. He taught me some amazing things that I just want to share with you. He says he wants us to realize that there's only one circumstance where a group of people traveling on foot can escape a highly trained army of these charioteers. And the only time that would happen would be when the group passes through a muddy seabed. Okay? The people on foot can walk across, but the chariot wheels get stuck in the mud. So when the chariot wheels are stuck in the mud, the army can't advance and it can't retreat. Now, if you've ever gotten your car stuck in the mud, even once, you know exactly what is being said here, right? So with the chariots, not only would they be stuck, but the horses, think about the horses, they'd be frustrated, they'd be panicked, they'd be lashing out, right? Thrashing about, potentially trapping the charioteers. Because if they were to get down, they'd have to contend with the horses lashing about, right? So in our Torah portion, when the wind that God sent stops, then the water returns to the seabed and the Egyptians are drowned. But the people on foot ahead of them, they were able to walk across before that. And, of course, that's part of the story of the Great Exodus. The powerful are now powerless in the hands of God, and the powerless are given freedom. And this reminds me of Psalm 147. So I'm going to read just two verses, and you'll recognize these verses. It's verse 10 and 11. Talking about God, it says, "He does not delight in the strength of the horse. He takes no pleasure in the legs of a man. The Lord takes pleasure in those who fear him, in those who wait for his loving commitment." So back to the Haftarah. Because we have so many parallels to the Red Sea story with the story of Sisera's army, we can surmise that a similar thing happened to Sisera in his army, even though it's not explicitly spelled out in the text. Now, the text does say that Sisera ran away on foot, so the implication there is that there was also a problem with muddy terrain. And I think when we look at this story and we look for parallels between this story and the Great Exodus story, we can see hints of this incredible faith in God that the Israelites had, because they were hatching this plan through the Israelite commander Barak, right? This is from our Haftarah. Barak's plan was to draw out Sisera to a specific spot, and this was done well after the rainy season had ended in the land. So Sisera would have seen that this was a perfect opportunity to get rid of the Israelite warriors in one big swoop, using those powerful chariots. Now, little background, the land of Israel, during the months of like April to September, there's not a lot of rain that goes on. So a warrior charioteer charioteer, they would know not to take a chariot out if there was a threat of rain, because the obvious issue with traveling with a horse and chariot would be getting it stuck in the mud. So we can kind of conclude that this battle in the Haftarah took place well after the rainy season, where there was no expectation of rain. So think about the faith that the Israelites would have had to hatch this plan. And I wonder if they thought back to the oral telling of the Passover story with that set of chariots. God came through for them then, right, by way of an unseasonably serious rainstorm that caused flooding in horrible road conditions. This is the story of the Haftarah. In Deborah's song that she sings, she mentions a tiny swerve from the stars in their paths. And Sisera's army of chariots become a death trap, perhaps because of the swerve of the stars in their paths to create this rainstorm, which they would attribute to God, of course. So once again, in this Haftarah, we see that the powerful are powerless in the hands of God, and the powerless have made their way to freedom. So once again, we have Psalm 147. God's pleasure is not in the strength of the horse, but in those who fear him and put their hope in his unfailing love. So this week, how about you and I write our own song of deliverance? And we can thank God for showing up for us in unexpected ways to deliver us from what's been oppressing us. But maybe first we need to cry out to him as the only one who can save us. When, not if, we fail to keep him in the front of our minds and hearts and actions, this in and of itself doesn't mean that we're going astray. It means that we need to run back to him with all of our might. And we need to think back to those times, like the Exodus story, like this Haftarah story, where when we cry out to him, he shows up big time. Because he is our deliverer. He was back then, and he is for us now. So, I'll see you next week in the next Haftarah.